Is euthanasia morally permissible? Daniel Callahan, in his paper When Self-Determination Runs Amok, argues no. In this video, I'll cover how he responds to the following two popular arguments in favor of euthanasia. The first argument in favor of euthanasia is the argument from self-determination. The basic idea here is that we can do what we want with our lives. Especially in liberal democracies like the United States, we should be able to make all life decisions, including where to work, what to say, what religion to practice, and when to end our lives. Callahan responds to this argument as follows. Euthanasia is not a matter of self-determination because it requires another person to end the patient's life, namely the physician. Not only does it require another person to help end the patient's life, but it also requires her to make a value judgment. For instance, that the patient's suffering is unbearable or her life is no longer worth living. But physicians cannot determine whether or not someone's suffering is unbearable because suffering is relative to the individual. The physician is also not able to determine whether or not the patient's life is worth living. So his response goes something like this. First, it is permissible to end another's life only if we can make value judgments concerning her life. In particular, that her suffering is unbearable or that her life is no longer worth living. Second, physicians cannot make such value judgments. Therefore, it is impermissible to end another's life. The second argument that Callahan addresses is that the medical profession has an obligation to provide for the patient's overall well-being and happiness. This makes sense to some extent. Becoming healthy will generally make people happier. When you're healthy, you're able to participate in sports, spend time with family and friends, and pursue your hobbies without worrying about an illness. But, according to Callahan, medical professionals are not trained experts in moral, religious, or cultural matters. Certainly, they cannot determine what makes a life worth living. To see Callahan's point a bit more clearly, ask yourself this. Is it the physician's job to balance your budget? Provide advice for raising children? To teach you how and when to pray? Your answer is probably no, and that's because many of us think that what physicians do is heal. They don't provide advice on money or religion. Their expertise is in the realm of medicine, where medical professionals are trained to prevent, cure, and mitigate the bad effects of diseases. How does this apply to the issue of euthanasia? Callahan argues that physicians ought to prevent, cure, and mitigate the bad effects of diseases and not make value judgments about how someone ought to live or end her life. In short, it is beyond the physician's job description to determine whether or not a patient's life is worth living. So, his argument goes something like this. Physicians are not obligated to provide services which are beyond the scope of medicine. Second, euthanasia is in fact beyond the scope of medicine because it requires the physician to make value judgments about whether or not the patient's life is in fact worth living. Therefore, physicians have no obligation to provide euthanasia. Thank you for watching 5 Minute Ethics. Please like and subscribe.